Hello, my name is Susanne Evans and welcome to the Change Stories podcast. This is a podcast for people who are interested in creating change, whether that is within organisations or for individuals. In each podcast episode, I will have a conversation with someone about their work to share their story. Each story and conversation will provide you with ideas and inspiration for your own organisation or for you personally. To find out more about each episode, including further reading, and to share your change stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk. Hello and welcome to the Change Stories podcast. My guest today is Vikki Kirby, Chief Storyteller from Vibrato Consulting. Vikki is a communications expert with over 30 years' experience in finding, crafting and telling business stories. In her in-house and consultancy work, she's helped hundreds of leaders and organisations of all sizes across the world find their strategic narrative and tell compelling stories. Spanning sectors from retail to healthcare, she has led a variety of change projects for organisations including Vauxhall Motors and BP before joining Home Retail Group, which owned Argos and Homebase, to share their narrative from board to store. In her consultancy work, Vikki is unpicking the complexities of storytelling as opposed to narrative, and we'll get into that later, and applying them to her practice of story listening, story crafting and storytelling, which she uses to help people think in different ways. She is a storytelling fellow in digital storytelling and is currently completing an MA storytelling at Loughborough University. There, her practice-led dissertation explores opportunities for organisations to connect strategic narrative to stakeholder stories, consistently helping them to focus their purpose and grow. Vikki, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast.
Hello, how are you?
All right, thank you. Yes, very glad to be talking to you. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, me too. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, there's so many things that I want to talk to you about, and I will definitely get onto your research, but I wanted to ask you how you first got into the field of storytelling and used it in your practice.
That's, interesting. I mean, you've just said, I have been a communications expert for 30 years, working in lots of organisations of different sizes, across different sectors, helping the organisation tell their stories as well as protecting their reputation, because in communications teams, as you know, a lot of it is about crisis management and the importance of protecting reputation. But it wasn't until I left being in a big corporate that I realised that I probably wasn't telling stories. I think there was narrative there. There was definitely narrative there. But what I was doing was essentially trying to sell the organisation to its stakeholders in lots of different ways, whether that be its product or its ideas, its strategy. I wasn't really telling stories. So it wasn't until I went to the Scottish Storytelling Centre in Edinburgh. They had a global gathering there of storytellers from around the world, cultural stories. So it was very kind of anthropological.
Yeah.
And I met there a Maori tribesman, and he said to me that in a situation where another group of people come in and take over your land with no consideration for your long-held traditions, the only thing that you have left is your story. And that really resonated with me because it's absolutely true. If you think about the successful kind of cultures, are the ones where they have managed to tell their story from generation to generation, maintain a sense of purpose, maintain a sense of identity, maintain a sense of who they are, and those long-held traditions come through, then the story is what has got them there. And these cultures would go to people and say, keep telling my story, keep sharing my story. So it was an understanding that story is something different. Story is very powerful, very meaningful, very human. And I realized that I wasn't really doing that in the organizations I've been in. I wasn't really telling stories. I was creating noise. So I got into thinking about what stories really are, and that's taken me on quite a journey since then. And I still don't fully know. I'll hold my hand up at this point and say, I'm still exploring. This is a very deep thing. Something interestingly, I think we all think that we understand stories and we know stories and we're hardwired to tell stories. But when it comes to thinking about them in an organizational context, and in other applied settings, it's a very difficult thing, very nebulous thing to grasp. So that's where my practice came in. So that's what I have been trying to do for the last 5 years or so, is to really understand what story is about and how they can help organisations to move forward in the way that they want to move forward.
That's so interesting. And I really like what you were saying about the noise in organisations, and also the idea of selling something to the outside world, because coming from my background in change and organisation change, that selling piece also goes on inside the organisation. So I think about a lot of the work that I used to be involved in terms of creating change and working on big change programs in organisations. And a big part of it was trying to persuade other people in the organisation that the change was a good idea, rather than trying to tell the story of both of what the organisation is and is going to be in a way that people could understand and see how it was relevant to them. And it's less about advocacy of a change and more about inquiry. And I think that was the tipping point for me moving into stories as well. So it's quite similar to you, but coming at it from a slightly different perspective.
Yes, I think change is one of those things that I'm looking at, other things being, leadership and the personal experience, attachment that people have to organisations because they feel heard. But all of that is part of the change that many organisations, all organisations want to effect change in one form or another, don't they? They want to move forward into the future. But I read the other day research from McKinsey, apparently, it indicates that transformations with a compelling change story are up to 4 times more likely to succeed. So I think you and I have talked about this a lot, that human element, that bringing people along with you, being compelling in a way that enables them to move forward in the way that, together, so that we're all on the same page, we're all affecting the change that we're trying to create. I think that stories have a really big place in that. And they're there, they exist, they're in organisations because they're in all of us as human beings. But they're not necessarily harnessed, if you like, in a purposeful way that helps us to move that change forward. We tend to stick with the numbers and the kind of the hard kind of salesy side of things, don't we? With the products that we're trying to sell, In Argos, when I was there, it was top 10 toys for Christmas. Those were the things that were compelling, that you had to move forward, and less about the human reasons behind why that change was taking place, that strategic change was taking place. So that's what I'm really interested in now, is exploring how that works across the organisation. And it shouldn't just be owned by the communications team. It's something that is owned by everybody within the organisation. I'm very passionate about that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And going back to that's the story that was told to you by the Maori person that you met at the conference, I think that idea of continuity is really important in stories, particularly during a period of change, that there's this idea that the organisation has to constantly be moving forward and can't carry anything with it from the past. Well, actually, I think that makes change harder for people to cope with. This idea of having something continuous is comforting and makes change easier for people to handle. I think that the thing that they value about the organisation, if you're able to tell a story about how that's going to carry on, then that's much more meaningful for people.
Completely, because you have to be grounded in something, don't you?
Yes.
Even if you've only been with the organisation for a few weeks, you've picked up some stories from the past. You're getting a sense of the culture because that's what people are sharing with you. So you already have that kind of induction, that past story induction, if you like, when you join the organisation. But you are, I mean, a story, a typical story, a novel or something. If you read a novel, typically, you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. That is the Aristotle way, is a beginning, a middle, and an end of a story. And that's where organisation stories, I think, are different, because there isn't that final chapter with the resolution and everything tied up neatly with a bow. You start another story, you start the next chapter, you move the organisation forward. If you don't, you end up with an organization that is consigned to history. People talk about Kodak and people like that, who didn't move their strategy and their story forward in a successful way. So I think, we have to think of organizations as being a continual story, a continual cycle of telling stories. But for me, the important thing is making sure that you take people along with you on that journey as leaders. You explain to people where you're going and how you're going to get there, and that they are very much part of the building, the creation, the delivery of that narrative, that story that you want to move forward. So that to me is fundamental, that you recognize you're in a story, there's a new story to be had, and that you're moving people along with you through that.
Absolutely. 100% agree. It has to be something that's a jointly created thing rather than something that's sort of deposited from on high. It has to be something that people contribute to.
Absolutely.
Now, before we go on any further, I wanted to ask you about this difference between story and narrative. And I know you and I have talked about this before, and for both of us, our understanding of this is a work in progress. I certainly think that that's true for me. And
Yeah.
The terms are definitely used interchangeably with different authors, but also with different people who are practicing in the field of storytelling. So, for example, a recent guest on my podcast, Dr. John Lorna, is working in the field of narrative medicine, and so he uses the term narrative. Other practitioners use the term storytelling. So I wanted to ask you, for you, what is the difference between the two?
It is a very difficult question, and I know from conversations with the eminent Professor Yanni Gabriel that he actually advised me for my dissertation not to spend too much time worrying about it, because there isn't a definitive definition. And I get that in narrative medicine you would use the terms interchangeably, story and narrative, and I think lots of people use the terms interchangeably. I find in organizations that I've worked in, corporates that I've worked in, the notion of story is difficult. People see that word and they think, children's stories, it's something playful. It's not really serious enough for us to spend our time worrying about. But I also think the notion of story is really important, because the story contains the story arc, the human element, the negative turn, and we should come back to the negative turn because that's something organizations are not very happy about sharing, which is a key part of story. But you have the kind of, the Freytag arc of stories is very important. It's the thing that connects us emotionally to the story. It connects us to what it is that we remember, that we learn from, that gives us an insight, gives us something to move forward with. And narrative I see as something that sits on top of that. So narrative provides the context in which the story sits. So let me explain, and this is just my view from my point of view of research about how I see the difference between narrative and story. So narrative, I would talk about a strategic narrative. So typically in an organization, you have a strategic narrative that will include an element of cost cutting, will include an element of customer journey, will include an element of digital optimization in the current world, will be something about product, will be something about place. It's quite factual. It describes what it is that we're trying to do. And if a chief exec is standing in front of the city and updating them on, what it is that the organization is doing, they will update around those kind of buckets, if you like, strategic buckets. I think a strategic narrative should come from that, but it needs to be compelling. It's not just a list of, I'm working with an organization at the moment, they have a list of 58 action points. Wow. Which you just can't get your head around. It's just too much. So you need some kind of narrative around that says, and here's what we're doing in showrooms, we're going to make them digitally enabled, this is how the customers are going to feel differently about us. You're bringing that to life. Stories in organizational sense, I talk about people's personal stories. So what's my part in that change? How do I feel about working here? Let me describe a way in which I learned something about, there was a great one, a story that somebody told me the other day, where quite a dishevelled customer came into a store and nobody else would bother with them because they thought, oh, well, they haven't got any money, I'm not going to go and serve them. It turned out to be this massive rock star who had absolutely millions and spent about £9,000.
Wow.
And his lesson was never judge a book by its cover. There's you always have to serve everybody. So those kind of stories have little insights which are quite local and quite personal. I call them personal professional stories, which are very much more human, very much about us. I think there is something in the middle which I'm struggling with at the moment, which is the organisational story. There's a very famous story from Hewlett Packard. I don't know if you've heard it, about the 9-day fortnight.
Oh, tell me the story though.
This is coming back to, I don't know, the early 70s when Hewlett Packard, there was a massive constriction in the marketplace and they were facing laying off a lot of people. And they just said to everybody, instead of having to get rid of jobs, why don't we all just cut our time by 10%? So everybody don't come in on the second Friday, stay at home, just work the 9 days. And we think that will save us enough money to save everybody's jobs. And that became folklore, that became legendary within Hewlett Packard and elsewhere. Everybody connected into that organisational story. It wasn't particularly strategic, but it said something about culture and values, which connected people very much to that organisation and became a big part of that Hewlett Packard story. So that kind of, for me, sits in between the strategic narrative and the personal stories. Does that make sense?
It does, and I absolutely agree with you. For me, that is the distinction between the two. But I think what is unhelpful, and you've said it, and Professor Yanni Gabriel has said it, is that kind of interchangeable term. And I think for people listening to this who are working in organisations and want to work with story, I would say don't worry too much about which word you use. It's whatever's going to work in your organisation, because you're right, Vikki, there is that sometimes, although I'm finding it less and less, I have to say, there's sometimes a bit of a pushback against story for people who think it's not very serious and it's going to be, Alice in Wonderland type things, rather than something that's practical and useful. But in reality, it's whatever works where you are, isn't it, for the term?
Yeah, I agree. And I'm doing a research project, so my assessors require me to go into the academic side of things and define exactly what I'm talking about. But you're absolutely right. For me, the more important point is, how do we within an organisation create a kind of listening culture that enables leaders to have conversations with those people on the front line, to hear their personal stories, ensure that they feel heard, but somehow, and this is what I'm really interested in, connect that with the golden thread back to the strategy. Because if you're going around an organisation and people are saying to you, oh yeah, I love the way that our product ranges are so much more popular with customers because this customer said this to me the other day, and that relates directly into the strategy. You have synchronicity, don't you? You have that connection. You're on your way to having a storified organizational culture, which for me is the ultimate place people should get to. Because if you don't have that, you either have people who are not going to accept the big change when it happens. And I found this in the organization I'm working with at the moment, that they have a listening culture, but the listening culture isn't connected to strategy. So when the big change happens, that's going to be quite a shock for people. So you don't necessarily have that, but in a more extreme case, you might have, again, what Professor Gabriel calls a counter narrative. People who are really engaged, and you and I have talked about this before, people who are really engaged are engaged at completely pushing back on everything that you're trying to do and creating disruption and disharmony, which is not going to get you where you want to go. So I think, it's important to listen, but it's also important to always be connecting that back to the change you're trying to make. For me, that's the really big thing about change. It's not hard, but it's not often done. I was talking to somebody earlier today who said, leaders just don't have time. They're only interested in the short term revenue target, and they're not having time, and they don't really want to put themselves out there into the organization in a more human way. And I think there are those kind of organisations around. Narrative deserts would, Yannick Gabriel would call them narrative deserts. There's no stories here, nothing to be seen.
The thing is, though, there will be stories, but they're kind of those unheard and unseen stories. And it's. I remember an organisation I worked in a while ago, and I did some interviews with some of the senior leaders, and everything was rosy and it was all marvellous, and everyone was, pointing in the same direction and all of that sort of thing. And I the conversation came around to politics, and I asked about, organisational politics and disruption and all that sort of thing. And the senior leaders went, no, we don't have any of that in this organisation. And I said, really? I just can't believe that that's true. No, there's no politics here. Well, of course, the more I delved into it and the deeper into the organisation I went, from the senior leadership to kind of middle management down to people on the ground, so to speak, there was loads of it, but it wasn't talked about, it wasn't spoken about. And so the people at the top didn't see it, and they weren't asking the right questions. So you talked about listening earlier, and I think that's really the key to storytelling, is to do the listening first, is to actually get out there and listen. But I think sometimes leaders don't want to do that because they're a bit worried about what they might hear or what questions they might be asked.
Completely. I mean, it's broadcast, isn't it, all the time? But yeah, you're right. That unmanaged organisation is a really difficult place. I was in an organisation as well myself recently where I saw that there was an awful lot of siloed thinking and kind of, for want of a better word, moaning about what was going on, but very little connection to or opportunity to share that with people, and it was very difficult to get anything done. And this wasn't an organisation that I would ever think would be like that from the outside as a customer, but from the inside there was a real lack of listening, a lack of connection. Co-creation is my other favourite word. Co-creation of stories, and then the research would come out, and everybody was wondering why people weren't feeling part of this organisation. That they were feeling disconnected from it. They wouldn't recommend other people to come and work here because that listening wasn't going on. There were too many barriers to what I thought would have been a very storified organisational culture. I was quite surprised.
Because I think this is the thing. In every organisation, there will be stories that are told. And the key point, I think, and what I find really interesting about your work is how you can connect those things together with the overarching narrative and story of the organisation, and also to understand some of the lessons that you can learn from some of the stories that are being told that are not linked in and are that kind of anti-story or countercultural narrative or whatever it is. Those, I think I always find it fascinating. You talked right at the beginning about that induction that you have when you join an organisation and you hear the stories from the past. And I always find those really interesting because they tell you so much about what individuals and teams value in that organisation, particularly when they're talking about things that happened years ago, but it's still of relevance and importance to them. And that to me is really important in trying to figure out how you create this connection. I was going to ask you actually about the negative turn, because you mentioned it earlier, and it's definitely, and said it's something we should come back to. And I definitely think it is, because it is something that organisations really struggle with. So for me, facing the reality of what actual real life is like. So you mentioned the story arc, and the story arc is people will be familiar with it from films, that there's always a dark time before the hero resolves their quest and comes out the other side. But organizations don't often use that in their strategies and their stories, because everyone wants to be positive all the time. But the issue is that becomes something that's not very authentic and not very believable to the people. And I've witnessed it myself recently in an organisation that I'm working with, this kind of over-optimistic selling of the change rather than, well, let's just be real here. Do you share my view on that it's something that's important that organisations and leaders need to be more open to using and sharing?
Completely. Because the story has to have a negative, stories work with polarity, don't they? From the negative to the positive. It's that exchange of energy, that little bit of drama, of tension that actually moves you through the story because you want to see the outcome. But I understand, I've been head of comms, and I understand the need from a reputational point of view. I mean, we've seen a big example of this in the last few days just with the BBC. From a reputational point of view, you need to control that story. You need to get ahead of it, that narrative. You need to get ahead of it before it causes you damage. So I understand this tension around negativity. When I talk about negativity, I don't mean that we've done something wrong as an organisation, that we're culpable for causing people to potentially be hurt in some way. I'm not talking about that kind of negativity. I think the negativity comes when the hero of the story, which for most organizations is typically the customer. So that's another key distinction. A hero of a story goes through that journey working towards their object of desire, but they don't know how to get to that point. They need a guide. So the guide is the company, if you like. The guide is the company helping them resolve that. So the negative turn comes, because, for example, if I'm a furniture retailer, I've got 15 people coming for Christmas that I didn't expect. I need a new dining table, a new sofa, etc., etc. That's my negative turn. And the company as the guide then is there to help them through that journey to achieve their object of desire, which is a happy Christmas. It's not a new sofa, it's a happy Christmas, isn't it? So that's where, for me, the story, that the negative turn is important. And if you follow people who are, training script writers like Robert McKee, he's fascinating because he talks about the negation of the negation. The more negative, the more high stakes it is, the more exciting the story becomes, because you have to take 2 or 3 twists before you get to your resolution. If we watch a film, we want things to get really, really bad before they get good. I wouldn't advocate that in organizations, but I think it's important to not be afraid to share and be open, especially internally. Hold a mirror up to ourselves and say, we could do this better. Let's work together to figure that out. And stories will come from that, on how, I was in a project, I hit a difficult patch, I didn't know where to go. I went to these people, I talked to these people, I worked with other departments. Digital departments are brilliant for this. They helped me, find that clarity that I needed, and I moved forward. Those become good organizational stories. So I think that's kind of where it comes for me. But we must not turn off the negative, because nobody out there will ever believe everything goes brilliantly all the time.
No, and I think when I'm working with individuals and on change projects, I always encourage them to acknowledge where there might be sticky patches in the project, but then to talk about how they're going to get through them. So that idea of the guide through them. This thing might happen, but don't worry, we're here and we've thought about it, and this is how we're going to make it better, rather than gloss over it and pretend it's not going to happen, because then it all becomes a bit Pollyanna then, doesn't it? And no one believes it. And I think you're right. Internally, it's a different conversation and a different story. But I have exactly the same conversations with my clients, is to say, you can't just tell everyone how great this is going to be and expect them to believe you. You have to be honest with them and tell people exactly how this is going to be. And if there are going to be difficult moments, then you need to be really honest about that, but also be honest about how you're going to deal with it, and that people aren't going to be expected to deal with it on their own.
Yes, and honesty, I think, is that truthfulness is a really important thing. But there lies the issue with stories, because, if I tell you a story about, I don't know, my daughter going off to university or whatever, and that resonates with you, and you tell that story to someone else and change it and embellish it, that's going to change. It's not necessarily going to be 100% truthful to the story I originally told you. That's the fantastic dynamism of stories. So I think we have to be aware, particularly in organizational settings, if somebody tells me a story, that might have come from 3 or 4 other people. So I can't hold that on face value. That I can't make fundamental decisions on that. This is the difference between the human culture and what it is that we're trying to achieve. We still need the numbers, we still need the data, we still need to measure the impact, but then we have to be clear about what is helping us to bring that to life. Does that make sense? That sounds
it does
a bit complicated.
No, I absolutely agree. It can't just be one or the other. It has to be a combination of the two. And while you were talking about sort of embellishing a story, it reminded me of a story that was told to me by David Lee, who I do a lot of work with around storytelling. He was saying he was at a conference and someone was up on stage telling a story about something that had happened to them. And another guy in the audience went, "Hang on, that wasn't you, that was me." And they were telling a story based on something they'd heard, but telling it as though it had happened to them. And I think that's a story I often tell when I'm working with leaders, is to say, absolutely use other people's stories, but be honest about where it came from. I heard this story, or someone told me this story, rather than pretending it was you.
I remember
Can you imagine?
And that there is a huge ethical piece about stories. If somebody tells you a story, and wherever you are, you have to be really careful about retelling the story. If you're on a stage at a conference and somebody's told you, you need to ask the person if you can share their story, and you need to make sure that you give that person credit, because it's a massive ethical issue. I had a story told to me about somebody who was literally outed in a big meeting, and they didn't realize that they were there, and it's horrendous, but it's really difficult. This is a nightmare for communications teams, just to kind of put myself back in in their shoes, because you do need to control it. I can remember writing reams and reams and reams of questions and answers around every single interaction that any exec had with the media, and that's important. And the great thing about what we did in Argos was to bring that to life. Everybody went out and everybody was telling their version of the strategy in such a successful way that Sainsbury's bought the business. But that didn't, I realized that didn't go into stories, that didn't bring out the stories. And there was one particular example of which was a really tricky one, because it was a customer service representative who had responded to a customer complaint on Twitter, and the complaint had come in a particular parlance. There was a particular, I guess you would call it street slang, the way that this person was engaging with this customer services representative, and the customer services person went back to the customer using the same language, but he wasn't from that community. He wasn't part of that culture. That was an incredibly risky thing to do if you think about the consequences of getting that wrong. As it turned out, it went great. It made the Daily Mail. It was retweeted 1,500 times, and everybody thought that Argos was suddenly really cool. But, the comms team, we were wringing our, in our hands. We were like, oh my God, we can't have people engaging in that way. But I think we were wrong about that. I think allowing people to be themselves, allowing people to engage with people in a way that makes sense to them, and giving that headroom for people to kind of be themselves and play it as they see it. That was completely on strategy, and it was brilliant as it turned out. We'd have dealt with it if it hadn't worked out. But don't make people so scared to say anything that they sit on their hands and then they leave all of their storytelling genes at home when they come to work. I mean, you said to me the other day, it's like, 3 out of 5 people tell stories outside work, and 1 in 5 at work.
Yeah, I know. Something happens in between leaving the house and going into work.
Yeah, exactly. And people are natural storytellers. For me, in my research, the thing that I'm interested in is connecting without going into manipulation, because that is another really scary area. You're not manipulating people. This isn't propaganda, but allowing these stories to come out, but somehow managing them to connect into that strategy kind of might help create the change that we're trying to make, might help us to move forward. And I see that brilliantly in companies like Brewdog. I think Brewdog do a brilliant job of it. And there are, other companies who kind of really live those kind of values, allow people to be themselves, and then they can move forward in positive ways. But as you know, this is so hard. This is easy for us to say, but this is so hard to do.
It's not easy. And I think, something you said right at the beginning about how our brains interact with stories very naturally, and there's loads of research to show that. But even though your brain or my brain might respond very positively to a story, it doesn't make it any easier for us to use story in a corporate context. I don't think it's that difficulty. We're quite happy to sit in a pub and tell a story about something that happened to us, but moving from that to this kind of corporate storytelling of strategic narrative is very different.
Yeah, I think all we can hope to do, certainly all I hope to do, is open people's minds and hearts to the power of stories and how stories reflect and add to the culture in their own organisation, and encourage them to bring a little bit of themselves to work, and encourage them to listen to other people and enable them to tell their stories. And I'm talking about people across the organisation, people right on the front line, as well as the middle managers, because it tends to stop with the middle managers, doesn't it? And then they're expected to, they're kind of the jam in the sandwich. They're expected to relay everything in a way we would expect them to. But actually, the great thing about this organisation I'm working with is chief exec will go into the front line and talk to people who are engaged in the day-to-day customer-facing piece, and listen to what they have to say and take their feedback on board, and more importantly, act on it, so they can see that they're part of the change. They are open to whatever's coming next as a result. It's not hard. I know it takes time and there's a lot of work to do, but I haven't seen anything that can have such a positive impact on how people feel about where they work than that just listening to people's stories. If you don't call them stories, great, that's fine. Call them whatever you want, but recognise that's what they are. They are stories, and they can give you a little piece of insight that you hadn't ever thought of that could make the difference between you and the competition.
I absolutely agree. I think my aim in life is similar. It's just to, if I can encourage one person to, the next time they're going to give a presentation or do a town hall about a strategy, they build in a bit of storytelling to that, rather than standing up with a slide deck and talking about strategy in that way. If I could create that change in an organisation, that would be enough for me, because that would make a huge difference.
Yeah, completely. Because I think it's also much more interesting, isn't it? It's much more exciting. I could talk to you all day about stories, but if somebody's telling me about how we're going to save ourselves a couple of million on, I don't know, rearranging the loading bay, I'm like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to get excited.
It's very hard to get excited about that. Although how you make that story, I'm not sure. But it's at the heart of what we do. It's human, isn't it? And I think certainly there's a lot of, from an academic point of view, there's an awful, it's not really, I know you've done this more than me with your PhD, Susanne, but there's so many different kind of interrelating fields. I mentioned anthropology and sociology, cognitive psychology, leadership, all the strategy, all the organizational disciplines, before you even get into narrative inquiry. And it's such an interdisciplinary field. Stories are just everywhere that it's really hard to narrow it down. People say to me, give me the 6 words that will change my business. Like, yeah, and you need to be on the inside. You need to be really kind of integrated in that organization and have lots and lots of conversations. It's not something that you can, that the organizations themselves, that leaders can easily do, I think. And you've certainly said this as well before, they need to sit and take some time and think and reflect and understand how their story, their personal story, might be interesting, might help aid connection, what they're hearing, if they're listening, when they hear a story, what they're going to do with that. The whole listening and the crafting is as important for me as the telling. So that takes a little bit of time for people to get their heads around. But when they do, boy, it makes such a difference.
Yeah, definitely. So I know you're right in the middle at the moment of writing your dissertation. So I don't want to put you on the spot too much. And I'm definitely not going to ask you about the 6 words that will change my organisation. But I'm just wondering, are there particular elements of your research that have surprised you based on where you started from when you first started doing it and where you've got to now in terms of what you've learned?
Oh God, there's so many. I'm in the black hole at the moment. I'm in the pit of euphoria. Yeah, I know what I'm doing. It's all great and fantastic. I have no idea. Let's start again. It's really yeah. There's so much to talk about. But yeah, I guess I know it's got a power of 3. Let me try and think of 3 things that I've really found. And a lot of that is from the case studies, so the primary research and the conversations that I've had with experts like yourself. I think it's some kind of key themes have kind of occurred. Listening organisations, organisations where people feel that they're listened to by senior leaders, that they have opportunities to grow, that they have opportunities to learn. That is incredibly powerful. I think leaders have a really big role to play, and people we've studied talk a lot about, the kind of hero status given to leaders in organizations, which is a hard thing to carry sometimes. But I think that leadership is really important, and people who give of their time, who are leaders. I asked about mentors, people who've been in your past that have changed the course of your career. Those people, do not underestimate the impact that you can have on people just by listening to them and telling the stories. So I think that's really important. I think the strategic narrative is really difficult to articulate. I've felt this myself in organisations. I work for one large oil company, I won't name them, but they were so big at doing the strategy, they moved on to the next strategy before you'd even had a chance to communicate it to people. So organisations that move so fast and make that strategic and don't articulate the change in a way that people can internalise as what I would call strategic narrative, relate it to themselves, relate it to their role, relate it to how they can make a difference, recognise the difference that they're making. I think that is really, really important. That needs to carry through the organisation. Ask them if it's working. If it's not working, then what can we do to change it? Because otherwise people just focus in on their immediate environs and what's important to them. And the third thing I found, I think, is that do not underestimate the scale of change. When people are talking to me about change, and I've seen this in the reading as well, the research people have done goes, it's like 400, I think you did about 400 hours of interviews, didn't you? It's just like
It's a lot,
massive amounts of data. It's like, you know, and it's difficult, isn't it? Because it's really one moment in time. You know, you have to think about how you're going to move that on. I have a sense of organisations which they've had a little bit of change. They're just on the cusp of introducing that change, and people are like, I can cope with that. That's fine. That's great. Yeah. That's okay. But you know that there is significant disruption coming, and if there's big interdepartmental tensions, that those are going to blow when you know you bring in a piece of change that really requires you to break down the barriers between those organisations, between those parts of the company. You know, people have to be thinking and working together. You know, I've had people say to me, I've had departments, you know, other people ring me up and apologise for their behaviour after the event. You cannot have that kind of situation. So yeah, I think my conclusion is going to be about, it's really simple, you know, listen, be purposeful in the connection to the strategic narrative, you know, allow people to bring out their natural storytelling abilities. Yeah, the rest of it really is about the academic world and how complicated everything is, and trying to make sense of all of that. I think in organisational context, it's really quite straightforward. But pay attention to those deserts, you know, that the unmanaged organisation we were talking about before. You know, the people who could have a hugely positive impact, who are not being listened to and have a negative impact. And I've heard some great ways in which I'm sure we don't have time to go into, but I've heard some great ways of ways that leaders have moved people around to have positive or negative impacts, or remove negative impacts and have positive impacts in other parts, and have grown massively as a result. So really is about playing to people's skills and understanding as managers, and managers as well as leaders are really important here. In fact, managers are almost more important because they can directly impact those people on the front line and make them feel like they're part of it in a really positive way. So if they feel disenfranchised, then I think it's a problem.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, that's kind of where I'm getting to, but it might change in the next month.
Well, you're going to have to come back on, and when it's all in, come back on and tell us all about it. And actually, what you were saying about moving people around into narrative deserts, I think that could be a whole other episode.
Yes, absolutely.
But it would be very good. Vikki, it's been so lovely talking to you. I really cannot wait to read your dissertation when it's all done. And I do wish you the best of luck with it all, because I've been there, as you know, and it's fun, but also not fun at this point. But if people want to find out more about your work and what you're doing, where's the best place for them to take a look?
Yes, thank you for having me on. Just to say, I've really enjoyed our conversation as always. I have a website which is www.vibratoconsulting.com, but probably best just to contact me on LinkedIn. Vikki, Vikki, Kirby, Kirby. That's probably, if you message me there, I'm on there quite a lot. So I'd be really interested to get people's thoughts and perspectives on what we've been talking about. And
I hope you will come on again at some point, because it's such a massive topic. I think there's at least one more episode, maybe even two.
I'd love to. We could have a whole series.
Thank you so much, Vikki. It's been really great talking to you today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Change Stories podcast. I love this conversation, and I hope you did too. Thanks as ever to my wonderful guests and to Pete Morgan at Monkey Pants Productions for making the podcast sound amazing. If you want to find out more about this or any other episodes of Change Stories, go to www.changestories.co.uk, where you will find all the episodes and show notes. If you have enjoyed listening, please rate and review the Change Stories podcast on your podcast listening platform. And do please let me know if you have ideas or requests for future episodes. You can contact me and find out more about change and storytelling on my website, www.feldsparconsulting.com. Thanks again for joining in with the Change Stories conversation.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.